My daughter took the $30,000 I handed her for a grand vacation in Bali, then stared me straight in the eye at the airport and said she'd forgotten to buy my ticket. She said it with the same careless tone someone might use to admit they'd forgotten to buy bread. Then she told me to just head home. What she didn't realize is that home is where a person roots their life, and where they keep the number of a very sharp attorney. By the time their plane touched down in paradise, I had already made a call that would twist their dream getaway into something far from relaxing. Before I go on, drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you believe respect isn't inherited, it's owned. The airport buzzed with a stale hum of recycled air and the steady rumble of rolling suitcases. It was a sound of departures, of chapters opening and others closing. I stood beside a tower of fresh luggage, the smell of new plastic still clinging to the handles. My daughter, Vanessa, had insisted on it. "We have to travel in style, Dad," she'd said with a wide, dazzling smile. And of course, I'd footed the bill, just like I had for the first-class seats, the 5-star villa, the entire $30,000 indulgence. It was meant to be my gift, a gesture of love to the family. Ethan, my son-in-law, fluttered nervously around the kids. His voice carried just a bit too high, too rehearsed, as he straightened our grandson Caleb's shirt collar for the third time, a gesture that was supposed to look parental but only revealed how jittery he was. Vanessa, on the other hand, wouldn't look at any of us. Her eyes stayed locked on the departures board, her foot hammering a quick rhythm against the polished tile. I was the only one standing still, a quiet, unmoving island in a sea of restless energy. I studied them, my daughter and her husband, and felt the ache of a distance that had nothing to do with geography. They were standing right next to me, yet had been gone from me for a very, very long time. At last, we reached the front of the line. The check-in agent, a young woman with a polished yet exhausted smile, gathered our passports. Her fingers tapped briskly at the keyboard, her eyes flicking across the screen. One by one, she slid the passports back to Vanessa, Ethan, and the children. Then she paused, her smile faltering just slightly as her gaze shifted to me. "Mr. Coleman," she said, her voice courteous but firm. "I have your passport here, but there's no record of a reservation under your name for this flight." The words drifted toward me like static, sounds without meaning against the steady hum of the terminal. I felt the weight of eyes pressing from the line behind us. Slowly, I turned to Vanessa, my expression asking a question I didn't voice. Her face, one I'd seen grow from the innocence of a child to the sharpness of adulthood, was blank, unreadable. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Instead, she seemed suddenly fascinated by a frayed thread at the hem of her jacket. "Vanessa," I said softly. My tone didn't rise, but it sliced clean through the ambient chatter. Ethan reacted first with a sharp, over-the-top gasp. "Oh, my goodness," he exclaimed, one hand clutching his chest. There must be some kind of mistake. But there was no mistake. I could see it in the way my daughter's shoulders stiffened, in the deliberate refusal to look at me. The truth stood before me, uglier than any fabricated excuse. "Dad," Vanessa finally mumbled, still tugging at that invisible thread. I'm really sorry. Work's been chaos. The kids, the packing." She finally lifted her eyes to mine, and they carried a thin, practiced apology. "I must have forgotten to book your ticket." Forgotten. $30,000 spent. And she claimed she forgot? Ethan, right on cue, leaned into his role as the earnest problem solver. "Sweetheart, don't worry," he said, dramatically pulling out his phone. "Let's see if we can grab a last-minute seat. It can't be too bad, right?" His fingers flew across the screen like he was playing to an audience. Then came the reveal, his face collapsing into a mask of exaggerated disappointment. "Oh, Mr. Coleman," he said, turning the phone toward me as though showing evidence. "A single last-minute ticket is nearly $3,000, and it wouldn't even put you near us on the plane. Absolutely outrageous." They stood side by side, a rehearsed duo. She, the scatterbrained daughter. He, the helpless fixer. It wasn't clumsy chance, it was theater. I felt it in my bones. This wasn't a slip. This was a performance. Vanessa stepped forward then, placing a hand on my shoulder. Ethan's hand pressed down on my shoulder. It felt heavy, not with affection, but but with a burden of dismissal. "Look, Dad," he whispered, lowering his voice as though we were co-conspirators solving a secret problem. "The flight's about to board. There's nothing we can do now." His grip tightened. "Why don't you just grab a cab and head home? Get some rest. We really do feel awful. We'll bring you back the best souvenir from the island. Go home." Those two words reverberated in my skull, hollow and sharp. He wasn't sending me home as family. He was discarding me like a child who had misbehaved, an inconvenience that needed tidying up before the vacation could begin. I looked past them. At Caleb and Lila, whose young eyes were wide with confusion. At the pristine luggage I had purchased for this trip. At the life I had poured into my daughter. Every opportunity, every ounce of stability, every dollar of support. And what I received in return was two words. Go home. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I didn't give them the scene they half expected. Instead, I met Vanessa's eyes, held them until I no longer recognized the daughter I had raised, only a stranger standing in her place. Then I gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right, Vanessa," I said, my voice steady as stone. "Have a safe flight." I turned and walked away without looking back. I could hear their sigh of relief ripple behind me. They thought they had won. They thought they were free of me. But my steps toward the exit were not the shuffling retreat of a broken old man. They were measured, steady, the quiet rhythm of a craftsman preparing his tools. The city streaked past the taxi window in blurs of brick and glass, familiar streets rendered foreign by betrayal. My reflection stared back at me, superimposed over the landscape, a weary man etched with a harsh glow of airport lights. For a fleeting second, I barely recognized him. But the moment passed. The eyes that met mine in the glass weren't tired. They were awake, sharpened. Go home. It no longer echoed with my daughter's dismissive tone. It had become my own command, a vow. The sting of betrayal burned only briefly. By the time I left that terminal, the fire had cooled into something harder, heavier, a weight like steel placed firmly in my hands. This wasn't petty family drama. This wasn't emotional chaos. This was geometry, precise, inevitable. A problem set before me, waiting to be solved. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They saw me as an old man, a wallet, a relic to be managed. They forgot whose hands built the very house they lived in, beam by beam, brick by brick. They thought they were facing a pawn they could sacrifice. They had no idea they were playing against the king. They had no idea they were staring across the board at the king. And they had just sent him back to his castle. As the taxi turned down my street, I felt no sorrow, no pity for myself. What I carried instead was a quiet, simmering focus. I wasn't some discarded father retreating in defeat. I was a strategist returning to his headquarters. The house greeted me in silence, as though holding its breath in the late morning light. Everything was exactly where I'd left it just an hour earlier. The same walls, the same furniture I had carved, the same framed photographs of a smiling family frozen in time. And yet, it all felt different now. The space was hollowed out, reshaped by betrayal I hadn't seen coming. I stepped into the living room and lowered myself into the armchair by the window, the one upholstered in faded floral fabric. Her chair, Marjorie's chair. In the stillness, I could almost hear her voice. Not heavy with sadness, but filled with that calm, clear wisdom she always carried. Marjorie had an artist's eye for detail. She saw the hairline cracks long before they split into breaks. Years ago, when Vanessa came asking for a hefty loan to buy a car she didn't need, Marjorie and I had sat on the porch, watching her drive away. "She has your hands, Daniel," Marjorie had said, her eyes distant, her tone heavy with knowing. "But she doesn't have your patience for the wood. She only wants a finished table." At the time, I brushed it off as a mother's worry. But now, sitting in her chair, her words rang as true as gospel. She used to remind me, money doesn't change a person, Daniel. It just makes them more of who they already are. In my grief after losing her, I forgot that truth. I mistook my generosity for love, when in fact, all I had done was pour fuel onto fire my daughter's weakness, fuel for the entitled woman she had become. The ache in my chest wasn't just for me. It was for her, for Marjorie, for the legacy of discipline, wake, and dignity we had built hand in hand. This was never about a forgotten flight. This was about the foundation of our life's work. and I wasn't about to let Vanessa grind it down into ashes. I rose from her chair, the sun warm in my back, and felt no hesitation. The fog I heard had burned away, leaving a clear, straight path. I walked into my study, the one room in the house that belonged to me and me alone. Its shelves were lined with books, woodworking, history, volumes I had worn down with years of study. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and old paper. At the center of the room stood the desk, a slab of dark oak, the very first thing I had ever built for this house. I built it to endure. I let my palm sweep across its cool surface, feeling the grain beneath my skin. This was no ordinary desk. It was a desk built for decisions, for moments that defined a life. I didn't need to reach for a number. I knew it by heart. I lifted the receiver of the heavy, old-fashioned telephone on my desk and dialed. The line rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. Law offices of Daniel Cho. Daniel, I said, my voice steady. It's Mr. Coleman. There was a short pause, then his tone softened, warm with recognition. Mr. Coleman, always a pleasure. Though I get the sense this isn't a social call. Is everything all right? I wasted no time. I need you to take immediate action on a sensitive matter. Draft the legal documents to temporarily freeze all access to the Coleman Family Trust, effective immediately. My daughter, Vanessa Coleman, is not to touch a cent. I could hear the faint clatter of his keyboard as he typed. Understood. May I ask the reason for this review? A fundamental reassessment of the trust terms and its beneficiaries. I replied, each word landing solid and deliberate. That will suffice for now. Very well, Daniel answered. I'll have the paperwork prepared and filed within the hour. When should I notify your daughter? This was the move that mattered. The keystone. Send the official notice to her primary email address within the next 5 minutes, I said. She's on a flight to Bali. She'll be unreachable for the next 6 hours. I want that email waiting for her the moment she lands and turns on her phone. Silence stretched across the line for a moment. I knew Daniel understood everything unspoken, the timing, the precision, the cold intent. Consider it done, Mr. Coleman, he said firmly, leaving no room for doubt. Thank you, Daniel, I replied, and gently returned the receiver to its cradle. I sat at the desk I had built with my own hands, inside the home I had paid for, and imagined that email, a quiet little messenger beginning its journey across the country. It was the first brick in the new foundation I was about to lay. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, the only sound in the house. Its rhythm was familiar, a heartbeat echoing through rooms that had felt hollow since Marjorie passed. The plan I had set in motion wasn't born from a single insult at an airport. No, this had been forged over years. Small betrayals, each one a fracture in the structure of my trust. And now the memories I had long buried returned with painful clarity. I thought back to a Sunday dinner, just months after the funeral. The house was draped in silence then, a silence we all tried to patch with meaningless words. Ethan, flashing his perfect smile, had gestured toward the cherrywood case in the corner where my collection of vintage watches rested. Mr. Coleman, he had said, voice thick with admiration. Every time I see those, I'm just amazed. They are not just watches. I told Ethan that night at the dinner table. They are history. I explained how each one marked a milestone. The first major contract I landed. The year Vanessa was born. The 25th anniversary I shared with Marjorie. Each piece wasn't just a timekeeper. It was a chapter of my life earned with sweat and patience. That's when Ethan saw his opening. He leaned forward, his face suddenly serious, wearing the expression he saved for when he wanted something. You know, Dad, he began carefully, they are just sitting there collecting dust. They are assets, underutilized assets. I held his gaze, saying nothing. He pressed on. There's a new venture I'm working on, and making the right impression is everything. If I could just borrow one of the more impressive ones, just for a few key meetings. It's about leveraging what we have to build a future. Leverage. Assets. Future. The words rolled from his mouth, empty and metallic, meant for balance sheets, not for things tied to the marrow of my past. Ethan, I said, my voice calm but firm. These aren't for leveraging. They are for remembering. They stay here. The change in him was instant. The polite smile drained away. He leaned back in his chair, sulking, pushing his food across the plate like a scolded teenager, though he was 37 years old. "Fine," he muttered. "Whatever. Just trying to make something of myself." He didn't speak another word to me that entire evening. That night, I saw it clearly for the first time. The greed dressed up as ambition. But grief clouds judgment. And back then, I was still shrouded in it. I told myself he was just impatient. I told myself he didn't fully understand. Now I know. He understood perfectly. He just didn't care. If the watches were the warning sign, then Vanessa's so-called business venture was a wildfire I tried to smother with $100 bills. She called it her passion project, an online boutique of overpriced scarves and trinkets. It lasted barely 6 months before collapsing. The first I heard of its failure came in a frantic call from Ethan. He brought Vanessa over that same evening. She was a master of performance. She arrived with no makeup, eyes rimmed in red, her posture small and broken as she sank onto my sofa. She looked every bit the fragile bird with a broken wing. The tears were perfectly timed, sliding down her cheeks as Ethan explained how creditors and suppliers were circling. "I'm so ashamed, Mr. Coleman," Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling. "I just wanted to build something of my own. I never meant for this to happen. I've let Ethan down." Her act was flawless. She wrung her hands, avoided my eyes, radiated sorrow. And I did what I thought a father was supposed to do. I protected my daughter from ruin. I shielded her husband from financial collapse. I preserved the family's fragile stability. I wrote a check to cover her debts. A check for $50,000. The relief that spread across Vanessa's face was almost biblical. She collapsed into my arms, sobbing with gratitude. "You're our savior, Dad," she cried against my shoulder. "I'll pay you back every single cent. I swear. I'll get a second job. I'll do whatever it takes." And I believed her. Or maybe the truth is, I chose to believe her. 3 days later, I was driving through the polished part of town on my way to the hardware store. At a red light, my gaze wandered to the pristine storefronts, the ones where the displays seemed more like museum exhibits than merchandise. That's when I saw her. Vanessa. She stepped out of a high-end handbag boutique, the kind of place where the price tags carry commas. There was no trace of the fragile, tear-streaked woman who had sat on my sofa, begging for mercy. She was radiant, triumphant. A bright orange shopping bag swung from one hand, and on her arm was a gleaming new leather purse that screamed money. She laughed into her phone, a carefree, joyful sound. The light changed. The car behind me honked. I drove on. But the image was seared into my mind, the woman who had sworn to repay me, and the woman who had just spent my bailout on her next trophy. I hadn't rescued her from ruin. I had bankrolled the next chapter of her irresponsibility. The watches had been a test. Vanessa's $50,000 bailout was a rehearsal. But the real target, the grand prize, had always been the Coleman Family Trust. Marjorie and I had built it years ago. It wasn't just numbers on a ledger or a portfolio of stocks and bonds. It was a condensation of a lifetime, the sweat on our brows, the sawdust in my clothes, the late nights hunched over ledgers and blueprints. All of it distilled into a single legacy meant to outlive us. It was never supposed to be a bank. It was supposed to be a gift, a foundation for Vanessa's future, something to stabilize her own family after I was gone. But lately, she had started circling it like a predator. It began with casual questions. A phone call here, a breezy comment over dinner there. "Dad," she'd say lightly, "my financial planner mentioned something. Our family trust's usually revocable or irrevocable." The next week, "Are there any provision for an early disbursement? You know, for a once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity." She was probing, testing the walls of the cage, looking for weaknesses. Each time, I gave her the same firm answer. "The trust is for your future, Vanessa, not your present." I thought that firmness would be enough. I was wrong. And sitting alone in the silence of my study, the ugly truth assembled itself in my mind. Random moments, scattered dots of suspicion, suddenly connected into one terrifying picture. The probing questions about the trust. The sudden, almost overeager suggestion of a lavish family vacation to Bali. The insistence that I cover every expense up front. And finally, the brutal humiliation at the airport. These weren't scattered acts of selfishness. They were coordinated. A campaign. The $30,000 trip had never been about family. It was bait. The cost of luring me to some idyllic setting where they imagined I'd be softened, off guard, right for signing away papers that would unlock my life's work. Leaving me at the airport hadn't been a mistake. It was an arrogant, sloppy plan B. Their fallback move when the first scheme collapsed. Even without my signature, they believed they were still entitled to the paradise I had paid for. That was the final proof. They didn't just want my money. They wanted my life story closed. The next morning, I put on the suit Marjorie always had made me look distinguished. I gathered my bank statements, printed emails, and placed them neatly in the old leather briefcase she had given me for our 10th anniversary. Once, that briefcase had carried contract for honest projects, structures I had built that still stood strong against the wind. Now, it carried the evidence of a foundation collapsing. Daniel Cho's office sat high on the 34th floor of a downtown tower, a fortress of glass and steel humming with quiet ambition. He was young, sharp, impeccably dressed, but behind his eyes was an old soul steadiness I trusted. He listened without interrupting as I laid everything before him on the polished mahogany desk. I didn't present it as a grieving father's sad tale. I presented it as a case. I began with the incident of the watches, establishing the baseline of entitlement. Then I showed the financial records, the $50,000 transfer to cover Vanessa's so-called business debts. Alongside it, I placed a printed photo I had pulled from her social media. Vanessa, beaming, clutching her brand new designer handbag, posted just 3 days after the bailout. Daniel studied the photo, then looked back at me, his expression unreadable. I continued, recounting Vanessa's probing questions about the trust, word for word. And then, finally, I told him about the airport. My voice didn't waver. I wasn't there for pity. I wasn't there to be comforted. I was there as a craftsman seeking advice about a failing structure. When I finished, I folded my hands over my briefcase. I am not here today out of anger, Daniel, I said evenly. I am here because the foundation is cracked. The load-bearing walls of respect and trust have been compromised. Before the whole house comes down, I need to know my option for reinforcing the structure. Daniel leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his legal pad. His eyes narrowed, thoughtful. Mr. Coleman, he said slowly, what you described isn't just a cracked foundation. It's a pattern, a deliberate, ongoing exploitation of both your finances and your trust. Reinforcing the structure may not be enough. I had expected him to rattle off legal clauses, maybe talk about adding amendments or stipulations to the trust. But instead, Daniel set his pen down, laced his fingers together, and leaned forward. His gaze locked onto mine, steady and serious. Let's speak plainly, he said. You came in here wanting to reinforce a cracked foundation. But you, more than anyone, understand what a true builder does. He finds the source of the crack. And what you've told me doesn't sound like something caused by pressure or time. This is a fracture poison from the very start. The metaphor hung heavy in the room, stark and undeniable. If we just add safeguards, Daniel continued, if we simply put stronger locks on the Coleman family trust, you'll be stuck in a state of permanent siege. Your daughter and her husband have already proven they are willing to burn the door down if it keeps them out. You will spend the rest of your years defending your choices, your rights, your very competence. A state of permanent siege. The phrase landed like a hammer against my chest. It named the slow, draining reality I've been living without even recognizing it, a constant battle against entitlement. What you're suggesting, Daniel went on, is defense. What I'm proposing is offense. We don't just shield the assets. We redefine the legacy itself. We restructure your estate so it becomes a living force for good, a testament to your and Marjorie's values. Something fortified in law and purpose, placed so far beyond their reach that it cannot be corrupted, touched, or manipulated. I stared at him. I had come into his office ready to bar the door against my own blood. Daniel was suggesting something far greater, demolishing the house and rebuilding it into a fortress. A fortress whose gates opened to the world, but not to the one person who thought it was his birthright. This wasn't just strategy. It was peace. I turned to the wide window behind him. Below stretched the city, a sprawl of steel and stone, countless lives built on foundations of one kind or another, some strong, some weak. I thought of the foundation Vanessa was trying to build hers on, rotted with entitlement and greed. And then I thought of another kind of foundation, a better one. I turned back to Daniel. "Do you mind if I make one call?" I asked. He gestured with an open hand. "Go ahead." I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed. My niece answered on the second ring, Imani, my late sister's daughter. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and alive with energy. "Uncle Daniel, it's so good to hear from you." There was no pretense in her tone, no hidden edge, just warmth. We talked for a few minutes about her classes, her professors, and the community center she was designing for her final project. Her voice lit up as she described it. Sustainable wood, natural light, spaces built to serve the elderly in the neighborhood. She wasn't talking about luxury or status. She was talking about building something that would last, something that mattered. She wasn't asking me for anything. She was sharing her passion. "You've got that fire in you," I told her, my throat tightening, just like your Aunt Marjorie. "Tell me, kid, do you remember what she used to say was the most important part of any structure?" I could almost hear her smile through the phone. "The part you can't see," she answered without hesitation. "The character of the builder." I closed my eyes. That was it. That was the answer. "You make me proud, Imani," I whispered. "You make her proud too." When I hung up and set the phone face down on my polished oak desk, a profound peace settled over me. The path forward wasn't just clear anymore. It was lit. I looked across at Daniel Cho, and he understood the moment he saw my face. The time for deliberation was over. "Let's do it," I said. "I want you to begin dissolving the Coleman Family Trust. Completely. And in its place, establish something new. We'll call it the Marjorie Coleman Foundation." Daniel lifted his pen. "Ready? Its sole mission," I continued, each word falling into place like bricks in a wall, "will be to provide full, 4-year scholarships for promising students in architecture and design, young people who want to build, not take. And when the time comes, the first person offered the role of executive director will be my niece, Imani Coleman." 6 hours and nearly 5,000 miles away, Paradise was living up to its promise. The air that greeted Vanessa and Ethan as they stepped out of the airport was thick with warmth, fragrant with salt and flowers. The resort lobby surpassed even their expectations. It was an open-air cathedral of wealth, soaring ceilings, lush greenery cascading down the walls, a breeze carrying the faint sound of a ukulele from somewhere unseen. They were handed cool towels and glasses of pineapple juice. Vanessa let out a sigh of pure pleasure. "This is it, Ethan," she whispered, clutching his arm. "This is how life is supposed to be." Ethan, feeling expansive and self-satisfied, surveyed the scene like a king admiring his new domain. He believed he had pulled it off. Ethan slipped his phone from his pocket, ready to post the first picture to social media, a casual shot of the infinity pool with a smug caption like, "Finally, some much-needed relaxation." As the device connected to the resort's Wi-Fi, a flood of notifications lit the screen, and buried among them was an email with a subject line that made his stomach tighten. It was from the law offices of Daniel Cho. At the marble check-in desk, the concierge, a graceful woman with a flower tucked into her hair, welcomed them with a dazzling smile. "Selamat datang, Mr. and Mrs. Coleman," she said warmly. "We just need a credit card for incidentals and the resort fee." Ethan, still skimming the legal jargon in the email on his phone, slid out the platinum card with a flourish. It was a card tied to the Coleman Family Trust. The card he believed had no ceiling. The concierge swiped. A polite frown touched her lips. She tried again. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said, her smile tightening ever so slightly. "It seems this card has been declined." Declined. The word might as well have been written in a foreign language. Ethan stared at the screen, disbelief flooding his face. He yanked the card back, his cheeks reddening. "Run it again," he snapped. "There must be a problem with your machine." Her professional smile didn't waver, though her patience thinned. She swiped again. Declined. I wasn't there, of course. But sitting in the quiet of my study, I could picture the moment as clearly as if I was seated in one of those overpriced lobby armchairs. I could see Ethan's confidence crack, shattering like brittle glass. I could see Vanessa's manicured nails digging into his arm, her whisper sharp enough to slice. Back at my desk, my phone lit up with the first text. It was from Ethan, his tone dressed up to sound calm, in control. "Dad, seems to be an issue with the card. Probably a fraud alert. Can you call the bank when you get a chance?" I set the phone back down. 10 minutes later, it buzzed again. This time it was Vanessa. Her tone was already souring. "Dad, they won't give us the room key. The kids are tired and cranky. You need to fix this." I kept reading my book. The calls began soon after. First, Ethan. I watched his name flash across the screen, let it ring until it slid into voicemail. A minute later, he called again. I ignored it. Then Vanessa's name flashed across the screen, her anger vibrating through the polished wood of my workbench. A moment later, Ethan again. Then Vanessa once more. It became a relentless, digital drumbeat, entitlement crumbling into fear. The texts followed in rapid succession, sharp with panic and accusation. "Why aren't you answering? Pick up the phone. Did you do this on purpose? Is this some kind of sick joke?" And finally, the one that carried her unmasked fury. "How could you do this to us? To your own grandchildren? You're a cruel, selfish old man. You've stranded us." It fascinated me, really. All the layers of charm and sophistication they wore like expensive clothes were being stripped away, one unanswered call at a time. What was left beneath was raw, ugly terror, the panic of two people who had just realized the bank they had been draining their entire lives had finally, silently, locked its doors. Back in my house, there was no chaos. There was only the scent of lemon oil and the steady rasp of a soft cloth against old wood. I was in my workshop, the only place where the world always made sense to me, where problems could be solved by building, shaping, restoring. In my hands was a small, three-legged table I had made for Marjorie on our first anniversary. Its surface had dulled over the years, and I was patiently bringing back its shine. On the workbench beside me, my phone buzzed like an angry wasp, skittering across the scarred oak. The screen lit up over and over. Ethan. Vanessa. Ethan again. A frantic pulse of desperation, trying to claw its way into my sanctuary. I didn't silence it. I let it ring. With each pass of the cloth, I would glance at the growing number of missed calls. 10, 27, 54. Every buzz was a demand. Every unanswered ring an accusation. But they weren't calling for me as a father. They were calling for me as their banker. They weren't worried about my well-being. They were terrified about their access. And in the face of their unraveling, I felt a profound, unshakable calm. I wasn't punishing them. I was teaching them. Teaching them in the only language they might finally understand. I was teaching them the meaning of consequence. The deep red grain of the cherry wood began to glow under my hand, its inner light returning with each stroke. I wasn't just polishing a table. I was restoring order. That was all. It took them 3 days to crawl back from Bali. 3 days of canceled budget flights, endless layovers, and the slow grind of humiliation that came with their self-inflicted exile. I knew the exact moment they returned. The slam of the car door outside carried a particular kind of fury. Their footsteps on my porch were heavy, indignant. They didn't bother to knock. They pounded on the door like debt collectors. When I opened it, the sight that greeted me was almost unrecognizable. Paradise had not been kind. Vanessa's cream-colored designer linen was wrinkled and stained, her blotchy tan framing a face twisted with exhaustion and rage. Ethan looked worse. The smug man who had strutted to the airport was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed figure with dark circles etched beneath his eyes, his jaw locked tight with bitterness. They barged past me without waiting, words rehearsed and sharpened for 3 sleepless nights ready to be unleashed. But then they froze, their outrage caught in their throats as their eyes landed on the living room. Daniel Cho sat calmly in the armchair opposite mine, one leg crossed neatly over the other. He wasn't looking at them. His attention was fixed on the leather-bound folder resting in his lap. The trap had been set, and they had stepped right into it. They had returned expecting to confront a lonely, cornered old man. Instead, they found a judge and his counsel, waiting for the hearing to begin. The silence lasted only a breath before it curdled into fury. Ethan was the first to erupt, his voice tight with wounded pride. "What is this?" he demanded, waving a hand between Daniel and me. "You don't answer our calls. You freeze our accounts. You leave us stranded halfway across the world with your grandchildren. And now you've got a lawyer sitting in our living room? What kind of twisted game are you playing?" He stepped forward, his expression a mix of disbelief and rage. "We were worried sick about you. We thought something had happened. We called and called, and you ignored us. For what? Because of a simple, honest mistake with a plane ticket? A mistake we already felt awful about." Vanessa slid into her role beside him, her voice trembling with manufactured pain. "It was the most humiliating experience of our lives, Dad," she said, hand pressed dramatically to her chest. "To be treated like criminals at that resort. To sleep on an airport floor with our children crying beside us. Do you have any idea what you put us through? All because your feelings were hurt." Together, they stood in perfect formation, a united front of indignation. They wove a story where they were the victims, painted as a noble, suffering parents betrayed by the cruelty of an unstable, selfish old man. It was a masterful performance, but I knew better. It was nothing more than theater, and I had already read this script. So I sat there, hands resting calmly on my knees, and let them perform. I let their storm of accusations break uselessly against the wall of my silence. I let their voices climb, falter, and finally burn out into the heavy stillness of the room. Only when I was sure they had exhausted every ounce of their rehearsed indignation did I speak. "Are you finished?" My voice was no louder than a normal conversation, but it sliced through the tension like a blade. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. I turned my head slightly toward Daniel Cho. Without a word, he picked up the leather-bound folder from his lap and slid it across the coffee table. The sound was soft, but in that silence, it echoed like a gavel strike. I opened it slowly. "You seem to be under the impression," I said evenly, my eyes locking on Vanessa, "that this is about a misplaced plane ticket." I pulled out the first document and laid it flat on the table. A bank statement. "This is a transfer for $50,000, I continued, "made from my account into yours to cover the debts from your so-called boutique." Vanessa's face stiffened. From the folder, I drew out a glossy printout, a screenshot of her social media post. I placed it neatly beside the statement. "And this," I said, tapping the image of her grinning with a brand-new designer handbag, "is a $2,000 thank you note. Purchased 3 days later." Her jaw tightened. She said nothing. I reached back into the folder. Of course, that was just the largest withdrawal. One by one, I laid down the evidence. Cancelled checks, credit card balances I had covered, receipts, neatly ordered in rows, each one another brick in the wall of their dependency. "Hey," I said, sliding another page across, "is $10,000 for the down payment on your car." "Hey," another, "is $5,000 for last year's property taxes." And then, with deliberate weight, I let a thick stack of receipts fall to the table. The sound was sharp. Final. Dinners, clothes, your club membership, hundreds of little indulgences, every one of them underwritten by me. They stared at the pile, their faces draining of color. The righteous fury that had fueled them at the door was gone. In its place was a waxy pallor of people caught with no escape. "You call the airport a simple mistake," I said, my voice lowering to a quiet, merciless calm. "I call it the final, arrogant withdrawal from a bank you have been systematically draining for 5 years." I let the words hang there, heavy and undeniable. I watched them, my daughter and her husband, their eyes flicking desperately between the documents spread across the table and my face, hunting for a loophole, some angle to twist the story back into their favor. But there was none. I gave a slight nod to Daniel Cho. "There's just one more thing," I said quietly. "You call the airport a mistake. But mistakes aren't planned, are they?" Daniel reached into the folder and withdrew a single sheet of paper. A printed email. "This," he said evenly, his voice stripped of judgment, "is a court-ordered copy of an email sent from Ethan Coleman to Vanessa Coleman 1 week before your trip." He held it up for them to see. The subject line reads, "The Bali Old Man Payout Plan." Vanessa let out a strangled gasp. Ethan went pale, as if the words had struck him in the chest. Daniel continued, reading in that calm, factual cadence of his. The body of the email reads, in part, once we get him to the resort, relaxing with a few drinks in him, he'll be much more likely to sign the disbursement papers. The $30K is steep, but the payout from the trust will make it worthwhile. The words didn't just fall into the room, they detonated. Color drained from their faces, leaving them waxy and gray. The proud mask of indignation they had worn shattered into dust, exposing the twitching greed beneath. There were no more words left for them, no more lies to spin. Only the naked truth, spread across the coffee table between us like a corpse. The room was silent except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. Each tick marked another second of their new reality. The stack of papers was no longer just evidence. It was a tombstone, marking the death of their illusions. Vanessa was the first to move. She rose stiffly from the sofa, her body brittle, fragile, like an old woman straining under the weight of years. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at her husband. Her eyes fixed on the front door, as if it were a faraway shore she had to swim toward. Ethan remained seated, frozen. His gaze locked on the email, his face hollowed out, like the empty frame of a building after fire has stripped it bare. At last, he lifted his head and met my eyes. What I saw there was not apology, not remorse, only the vast emptiness of a man who had wagered everything, and lost. He stood, then followed his wife to the door. I didn't tell them to leave. I didn't have to. The truth was now the landlord of this house, and it had already evicted them. Their footsteps retreated down the hall. The front door opened, and then it closed, not with a slam, but with a soft, final click. There was no triumph in me, no surge of victory, only the heavy calm that follows a storm, the kind that leaves behind wreckage but also clarity. Order had been restored. Weeks slipped by in a quiet that was deep and restorative. The silence from Vanessa was no longer a weapon she wielded against me. It was simply a consequence she had to endure. During that time, Daniel Cho and I worked steadily. We weren't tearing down anymore. We were building. One morning, I met Amani at a small cafe downtown, the kind where the air was rich with roasted coffee and fresh bread. She was radiant, her youth, her purpose, filling the space around her like light. Between us on the wooden table, I set down a new folder. This one wasn't black with evidence. It was deep blue, the color of promise. I asked you here today, I said, sliding it toward her, because I wanted to show you the plans of my next project. She opened it. Her brow furrowed as she began reading, then her eyes widened. Her fingers traced the words at the top of the page. The Marjorie Coleman Foundation. I told her everything. I told her the mission, to fund scholarship for gifted young architects and designers. I told her it was rooted in the belief Marjorie had carried her whole life, that the most beautiful thing a person can build is a door for someone else to walk through. Tears filled Amani's eyes, but these weren't the tears of performance I had seen weeks ago in my living room. These were quiet, genuine, full of understanding. Uncle Daniel, she whispered, her voice thick. This is everything she was. Everything you both stood for. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. A foundation needs a strong custodian, I said softly. Someone with vision, integrity, someone who knows that the character of the builder is the most important part of any structure. I let the words linger. When you graduate, I told her, I want you to be its first director. I'm not offering you a job. I'm entrusting you with a legacy. In her eyes, I didn't see the hunger of an heir. I saw the steady fire of a builder, ready to begin. Now, I am back in my workshop. The house is quiet, but not the oppressive quiet of absence. It is a clean, gentle silence of peace. 4 years, I believed my legacy was a number in a bank account, a safety net woven for my daughter. But I have learned this. You cannot build a net for someone determined to cut the ropes. My daughter and her husband saw my life's work as a vault waiting to be cracked. They never understood that its true value wasn't in the money, but in the dignity of the work itself. They wanted the finished table, but they scorned the wood. They ignored the tools. They disrespected the calloused hands that shaped it. A true legacy isn't what you leave for people. It's what you leave inside them. The Marjorie Coleman Foundation, a structure designed to open doors for others, that is a legacy. What Vanessa and Ethan wanted was just an inheritance, and I have finally learned the difference. As for me, My work isn't finished. I'm planning a trip, a real one this time. Not to some sterile resort, but to the coast of Ghana. To walk the shores where my family's story began generations ago. I've spent my life building a home. Now it's time to see where home first began. And let me be clear, I didn't do any of this for revenge. I did it for the one thing you can't buy. I did it for self-respect. Because dignity is the one house you must build for yourself. And you must never, ever hand anyone else the keys. This story was never truly about money. It was about the slow erosion of respect that happens when love isn't protected by boundaries. For years, I believed my duty as a father was to provide without question, to be a safety net. But I learned, in the harshest way, that generosity without respect is nothing but fuel for greed. A true family legacy is not a vault to be plundered. It is a standard of dignity to be upheld. And guarding your peace, your boundaries, your worth, that is not selfish. That is survival. So I'll leave you with this. What would you have done in my position? And what do you believe is a true meaning of a legacy?